this week's episode of Done and Dusted. I'd like to introduce our special guest this week, Dr. Phil Stahl, who's come all the way from San Diego, but he's sort of an adopted Aussie these days. And before I say a formidable hello to him, I'll say hello to my co-potty, Counsel of Counsel Family Lawyers. Good to see you again this week, Cass.
Absolutely, Daz.
Yes, always a big smile, which is lovely. And back to Phil. Welcome back to Oz, Phil.
I love it here. You know that. You nicknamed me an honorary Aussie, I think, in 2015, and I've continued to love this country every time I get a chance to be here.
Yeah, well, look, Carolyn and I know Vince Papaleo very well, but I always refer to you as a Vince Papaleo on steroids from the United States. Because you've written, your biography goes for about 29,000 pages, your CV. You've written a number of books. You specialize in children's matters, parenting matters. And you've just got an incredible back history and record, Phil, and you've been doing this for how many years?
Going on about 40 right now.
Yeah.
I'm older.
Yeah.
I'm older than I look. I get it.
Yeah, and I've actually used Phil as well, Caroline, to do shadow reports for me.
Yeah.
For clients, and I've found that very useful. And it's sort of it's a segue into what we want to talk about tonight in relation to confidential bias in family reports.
Which, you mean confirmatory bias?
Oh, sorry, confirmatory bias. What did I say? Confidential.
You got to remember, Phil, we are mere lawyers.
Yes.
So go easy on.
So not only that, I've known Daz for at least 10 years, and I'm used to him both teaching me how to speak Australian, but also in terms of making mistakes like that.
Yes. Well, shame on me, because I think I've attended at least 4 of your presentations on confirmation bias, and they're excellent. And you might be able to tell us a little bit by way of introduction what that actually means, because a lot of our listeners wouldn't understand what that means.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I wish if I had my computer, I could even do a couple of visual things, but I'm on my iPad where I don't have those materials, so I can't do that. But one thing I want to say about being an honorary Aussie, I truly mean it when I say I love your country. I would love to be here even more than I'm going to be here. And my wife and I are hoping to split half a year each between San Diego, which, by the way, that's a golf course from San Diego in the visual behind me, as well as here in Melbourne, where I have an apartment and just absolutely love it here. And I thank you both for inviting me to be here tonight. We've been, you and I and Justice Tom Altabelli from Sydney area. He used to be in Wollongong.
We had him on last week, Phil.
Oh, did you? Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, the 3 of us have presented a few times on this topic and other issues and decision making in the courts. And I'm going to try to paint a visual with words if I can. And as you know, most Americans and most maybe even Canadians and Brits and others in Northern Hemisphere talk about Australia and New Zealand as being down under. Imagine, if you will, the frame that sets up about how different Australia is from us, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Tom, when he did a presentation with us, you may remember that. He has a flag of the world, a globe of the world with the Australian flag on top. He says, yes. Some of you think we're down under. We think of us as up top. That kind of frame that goes into how we think is part of confirmation bias. It's part of the way we utilize the brain to make decisions, and sometimes framing sets up a confirmation bias. Yes. So let me give you a few more examples. Imagine, if you will, the need to be neutral, right?
Yes.
Now, what team do you barrack for in footy?
Well, I back for the Hawks. Who do you back for, Carolyn?
The Miami Dolphins. No, that's my husband. He's also an American. I barrack for the Bombers.
Okay,
Essendon.
so back to your husband, Dolphins. My next door neighbor is a Dolphins fan. I'm a Detroit Lions fan, which means I always support a losing team, except for maybe this year they're going to be better. But anyway, that's because of where we all grow up, right?
Yeah.
And who we barrack for in that regard. We want the referees in footy to be unbiased, correct?
Yes.
They make decisions, they make calls on the field, and we automatically think if they're for our team, good decision. If it's for the other team, they must have been biased.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So that's another way of thinking about bias. And confirmation bias is continuing to believe that and looking for evidence that supports that bias. Now, my favorite sport outside of Michigan football, which is a college team that I went to Michigan, is ice hockey. And you don't have much ice hockey here in Australia, but you do have an Australian Ice Hockey League. You may not know it. And Ruth and I have been to a game, a hockey game at the ice arena at the Docklands. And when we were there, it was kind of cool to watch that. But always you think of the decisions that get made there are instantaneous decision, whether something is a foul, which is called a penalty, and they miss some and they make some, and you know what? They're human beings. But if they go against our team, we think they must be biased.
Yes.
So
yes.
the whole idea of decision making is for people like myself, other parenting plan evaluators, your report writers, your judges. You want to be unbiased and make decisions based on evidence or data that helps understand the family. And most parents, when us report writers are done with our reports, think that we are biased. And why do they think that? They think it because the report went against them.
Yes.
When I get brought in to do shadow report, an expert to critique somebody else's work, I'd say 90% of the time, they think the evaluator is biased.
Yes.
And that thought that the evaluator is biased is something that I look at constantly to figure out what's going on here. And what I see more than anything is two things. I'm going to call them out and then explain them. It's called anchoring bias, or an anchoring heuristic. Remember that word, heuristic.
Yes.
Heuristic.
Explain that, Phil. Heuristic. Explain that for our listeners, what you mean by heuristic in case they don't understand it.
I'm going to do that in half a minute.
Right.
And the other one is confirmation bias, or the confirmation heuristic. So being human, our brains tend to oversimplify complex data. As it gets more and more complex, we use various methods to oversimplify and make it easier to understand. Those methods are called heuristics. That's what a heuristic is.
Right.
So in my world, suppose I hear a mom come into my office and she's telling me about family violence and coercive control, and our husband always is controlling her. And if I'm of the mindset that, and this is where the framing comes in, right? I told you about with the flag on top.
Yep.
If I have a frame that when moms come in and talk about their husband's being controlling, I need to believe it. That frame and the hearing it first will cause an anchor. Imagine a ship in the ocean, and they've got an anchor to stay in place. That anchor is anchoring bias. So I'm going to all of a sudden anchor to the data that I'm hearing from her. Then I see Dad, and Dad's going to say, she's full of crap. That never happened. And instead, she's just trying to alienate the kids from me. So now I've got another possible anchor. I've got the anchor of family violence. I've got the anchor of coercive or alienation. And now I have to sort it all out. Well, if I oversimplify, and I have a belief that family violence is more likely to be real in general, I'm going to use that anchor, the family violence anchor, and look for data to support family violence and disregard the data that supports alienation. If I believe that the alienation anchor is more prevalent, that the data supports that most domestic violence is made up and with moms who alienate their kids against their fathers, I'm going to anchor to the alienation piece and look for data to support alienation and disregard data that supports the family violence. The next step is confirmatory bias. And that's what I mean when I talk about only looking for data that supports one thing and doesn't support the other.
Right. So the anchoring comes first. The confirmatory bias comes second in terms of looking for data that is attracted to that anchoring position. Yes?
Yes. Let me give you an example outside our work. And I love to give this example outside the US because in the US, people might think I'm being political, which I'm not. It's really just, I'm never political, right? You know me, Daz.
What's that word? Trump?
No, you don't get me started. But if we remember back in 2003, when after the 9/11, when the Twin Towers were blown up.
Yes.
And President Bush at the time was looking for who was at fault.
Yes.
And he blamed Saddam Hussein in Iraq, saying that they had weapons of mass destruction. Remember that?
Yes. Very well.
It got us all into big wars. Australia, like always does, supports the wars the US gets involved in or other wars globally that are important. And the US and the Brits and Australians often go in together aligned like this. In that place, Bush had lots of evidence that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. And the confirmatory bias is he only wanted to believe that they did have weapons of mass destruction.
Yes.
So his brain, small brain that he has, okay, that's the politics, only believed the weapons of mass destruction and disbelieved the other. So decision makers, whether they're presidents of the United States, or whether they're judges, or whether they're report writers, need to look for data that do support our initial way of thinking, and also for the data that do not support our initial way of thinking.
So Phil, as a discipline, how do you go about as a report writer ensuring that you are doing those checks and balances? I mean, you know, in the flow of the conversation with one parent, knowing that the other parent's waiting out in the waiting room, even choosing one parent to go in over the other parent, big no-no. How do you use the checks and balances to get that right?
It's a very difficult process, and I can't begin to think that it's easy or that just believing, okay, I'm going to be unbiased is going to help you. In fact, the research supports the debiasing research that's directly on point to your question, supports the idea that when people think, oh, I'm not biased, it's not going to be, I'm not going to create that problem, they do create those problems. So the process has to have more than just believing I'm free of bias. So one thing I do as a report writer is I give each person the opportunity to have a first appointment with my brain not affected by what I've already heard. It doesn't matter who it is. And I go through the same process with each parent about hearing their story first. Some report writers and some reports and some parenting plan evaluations, which is what they're called in the US, are more limited in scope. They don't spend too much time with people. They might only have one appointment with each parent. Well, you can't then go back to the other parent and say, look, this is what I've heard from dad, what do you tell me? And this is what I've heard from mom, what do you tell me? How do you respond? Those kinds of things. So you need at least 2, but I really believe 3 or 4 appointments to be able to get enough data to reduce the risk of anchoring and confirmatory bias. The second thing you need to do is be curious. Y'all know the line from Alice in Wonderland, curiouser and curiouser? We want to be curiouser and curiouser. We can't stay with the superficial, with what mom tells me superficially, dad tells me superficially. We need to help me understand more about this. Help me understand why you're concerned about it. Help me understand, and those are words that I ask all the time. And the next thing you want to do is try to avoid, and it's hard, reaching conclusions till all the data are in. I take great pride in saying to myself or anybody that asks, what are you thinking now? I don't know. When all the data are in, and I've done my process in depth, not superficially, but in depth and with breadth, getting all the information I need to get, then I resort those data in with an eye to, it could be either or both and. And I'm going to give an example in just a moment after I finish answering the question that really helps to manage and control for the biases rather, and even though I know that they're not, I'm going to do it well enough. I may not. I don't know. I'm a human too, so I want to guard against that. 2 things I'll mention. One is that when you ask forensic psychologists whether they think they are biased, most of them will say no. Are they affected by their biases? Most will say no. But when you ask the same forensic psychologists, are their colleagues affected by bias? Most of them will say, of course. So that's a real problem, right? No doubt about that. So I know we only have a few minutes left. Can I talk about an evaluation I've just done recently and the way that works out?
Yes,
so
I think Phil, you'll have to come back on. I think this will just be part 1 because
I think this is going to be part 1 because it is so fascinating, Phil.
I find it very interesting.
I'm glad you do, and I hope your listeners will as well.
Oh, they will.
The family I'm going to talk about, both parents had really screwed up upbringings with abuse. Mom had a history of sexual abuse as a child. She had a terrible relationship with her father. Her mom didn't protect her, but she now has a better relationship with her mom. Dad was raised in an abusive family as well. He wasn't sexually abused, but he was physically abused, neglected. By 13, he didn't want anything to do with the family. He, in time, had become, he's in the arts world. I won't tell you what type of performer or art it is, not to give anything away, but has become very wealthy and well known worldwide. So that's why I need to be very careful. But both of them then met each other and had two kids. And when the artist was away, the mom was parent. And when the artist was back, the artist also got into substance abuse problems and other things like that. Mom very much wanted to protect the children from any harm, and viewed dad as being a harming parent. At the end of the day, when the case comes to me, mom needs to work out her history of abuse and her overprotection of the kids. Dad needs to become a better parent because he never really was that involved as a parent, and can't just expect these kids who are now teenagers to suddenly drop their world and want to see him the way that he wants them to see him. He needs to improve his parenting skills. Everybody needs to gather trust for one another. So it's not either or. It's not, mom is alienating the kids against the dad, which he believes. It's not just he was a harming parent because he was not there, and he wasn't a very good parent when he was there because the substance abuse and the unpredictable anger outbursts. Oh, and by the way, there's another and in there. These kids are adolescents who have their own life, who maybe don't want to spend time with either of their parents that much. And he's trying to jump into that world without enough empathy for the kids and what they're going through. So it's not all about what she's doing wrong, although dad would like to believe it. It's not all about what dad's doing wrong, although mom would like to believe it. Kids are more aligned with mom, but they have since birth because she raised them and all that. So we have to keep,
Phil, isn't it? It's very layered and complex.
And that's why we have to not make any decisions about all this till all the data are in. Because otherwise it's too easy to say, mom's the problem here, because if she would just make these kids go to see with dad, all would be good. Or it's easy to say, dad screwed everything up for 12, 13, 14 years. He should just kind of live with it. It's his problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think too often there is too much weight put on our family reports in the sense that a lot of them are untested, either because the system works against testing them because of delays and costs or attrition. And it's a real problem in our jurisdiction, because I know when you've done shadow reports for me, talking about Curiouser and Curiouser, often I get back these reports from Phil, Caroline, and they are tagged with all these virtual sticky yellow things all over them in terms of what the report writer could have asked and didn't ask. And that's just putting confirmation bias and anchoring to one side, because obviously data is gold in these matters, and you need that data in order to come to ultimately recommendations that serve the best interest of children and that particular family dynamic. So unfortunately, Phil, we are just about finished here tonight, and it's been fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But before I sign off from you, I'm just going to turn to my fellow potty here. What have you got out of tonight, Caroline?
Well, I'm so glad, Phil, that you did use that phrase, curious and curiouser, because as a collaboratively trained practitioner, that is the journey that we all go on, to go not just to see the surface, but also to appreciate how layered and how complex this is. And that when we meet people, their story doesn't start with when Harry met Sally. The story starts...
One of my favorites, by the way.
I'm so glad. We've got so much in common already. But the story has started a long time before these two planets came into each other's orbit. And I think we've got to remember at the heart of everything that we do are children. And therefore, it's important to absolutely get it right. And I too, Darren, ask you, my fellow podcaster, what's your takeaway from this particularly riveting episode of Done and Dusted?
Yeah, well, I really love the way Phil explains it in terms of the anchoring and what flows from that. And the way what I've got out of what Phil said tonight is really underscoring for me how important it is for barristers and solicitors working in our jurisdiction to actually secure the notes taken by these report writers prior to the trial, not the day of the trial, but at least 7 days prior to the trial. And what I've been doing, Caroline and Phil, is I've been using a different colour highlighter for each parent and looking at initially how long the report writer speaks to each parent. And then I go through the reports and look for the data that's either positive or negative in relation to each parent, and try and work out if there are any perceptions or allegations of confirmation bias, where the report has been let down by the report writer not grabbing onto positive things that might otherwise mitigate against that bias they've formed in terms of their anchoring. And I found that really an interesting journey. And I'll give you a quick example to finish off on. I had a report writer that was absolutely anchored to the fact that my client had committed family violence against this woman and the children. Now, he may have, but not to the extent that she was saying. But one of the snippets of evidence she put into the report was that when she was doing the home visit, she noticed that when the dog approached the husband, its tail was down. And therefore, it must be afraid of the father. And it's afraid because no doubt the dog has seen evidence of family violence in the household. Now, that was the extent of that, which is quite incredible. But it's just finishing up. It's a really worthwhile process to do that. And we don't do that. And probably the only reason I really do it now, apart from Justice Maguire telling me you should, is that listening to you, Phil, and Justice Altobelli, in terms of this particular topic of confirmation bias, because it's really rife, and us as practitioners got some responsibility to properly investigate it. And as Caroline said, be curious. So, what do you have?
One more thing
wisdom to finish up on.
Thank you. With that. Another thing for debiasing, we must have multiple hypotheses.
Yes.
This report writer only had one hypothesis. The dog's tail was down, therefore it meant X.
Yes.
You need to ask parents, I noticed the dog's tail is down. What do you think that means? Is that always the way the dog's tail is? Or other kinds of questions about that. So it's the multiple hypotheses that go with being curious and all that. There's a word that I learned years ago called humbition. And what humbition is the ambition to do the best job we can, and the humility to know how difficult it is and how hard it is as a human being to do that work. If we all have ambition, we can succeed in a better way. I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. If your listeners want to know how to reach me, I'm sure one of you will let them know how to reach me through my email and all that.
And I think that was a magnificent way to conclude this particular podcast, what you just said there, ambition. I remember that.
I'm very ambitious now.
I'm very
Good.
ambitious.
Good on
Very
you.
ambitious. I
Thanks.
thank you, Dr. Phil Stahl, for being on our show this week. And please, listeners, if you're interested in some of you can just Google Dr. Phil Stahl. He's got numerous books out on parenting and the like, and much more. And I'm sure now he's in Australia much more often. He'd be more than happy to assist any professionals out there who need his expertise and guidance. And I thank my fellow podcaster, Caroline Counsel, as always, a delight. And we look forward to presenting next week another episode of Done and Dusted. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Darren. Thanks, Dr. Philip.